I just wanted to say real quick that this is the second part of a two-part story, so if you haven't listened to part one, be sure to do that before listening to this. Randy and his new companion rode on into the night. It was warm, and Randy didn't need the blanket that had been packed in the box, so he folded it a few times and turned it into a makeshift pillow. Hope curled up very close to Randy and began sucking her thumb. The amputation of her leg was done under sedation, and she hadn't started to view humans as a threat quite yet. She cooed softly, and Randy felt the guilt of his experiments seep in again. Less than 24 hours ago, he was in one of the most sophisticated labs in the world, working with technologies beyond many people's comprehension. Now, he was curled up on the floor of a bouncing train car with a chimp on the run. Randy was exhausted. Sleep was the last thing on his mind considering his circumstances, but he'd been sedated before they put him in the tube. The rest he got wasn't real rest in there. Also, it didn't feel like whatever drugs they had put in him had fully left his system yet. His body felt okay, but now that he had time to sit without adrenaline and feel, he realized his mind still felt like it had when he awoke in the tube. It felt like a puddle. The bob of the train car was oddly comforting and hypnotic. Eventually, he drifted off to sleep. Again, his sleep was dreamless and black. Randy and Hope awoke to a screeching sound that ripped through the air. Hope jumped up and started trotting around the train car in a panic on her hands and one leg. Randy shouted, "It's okay, calm down, girl." He knew that the train was stopping, but his chimp companion might as well have thought it was the apocalypse. He ran to her and picked her up. She buried her face in his chest and wrapped her arms around him. Remembering what the letter that had been in the box said, Randy knew they needed to get off before the train stopped, and he had to take everything with him. He kneeled and very delicately pulled Hope from his chest. He looked at her and said, "You've got to ride back here, okay?" Turning, he grabbed one of her arms and helped her onto his back. Then, he jammed the blanket back in the box, along with the half-empty water bottle, and put the lid back on. He tucked it under his arm and walked over to the door of the train car opposite the side they came in. The squeak it made, when he rolled it open on its tracks, mingled with the screech of the brakes. Sunlight poured in, and Randy squinted to see the green blur of trees in front of him. The train was still moving fast, but starting to slow. Soon, he and Hope would need to get off. Randy knew too much about physics to attempt a jump, especially at their current speed, but he knew they'd need to get off in enough time to not be noticed. His best bet was to wait for the train to slow down, lower himself, and then match its speed as he ran along the side of it. This is something he ordinarily wouldn't have had an issue with, but still being a bit wobbly and having a chimp on his back added interesting dynamics to his situation. Eventually, the train slowed to a speed that felt comfortable to Randy. He threw the box from the train, planning to walk back and retrieve it once they were safely on the ground. With Hope on his back, he began to climb down the short ladder connected to the train car. He wished there had been one on the other side as well. They climbed down and hit the ground running. The stones that were mounded up by the tracks shifted slightly beneath Randy's feet, but offered a much smoother runway than when he'd climbed on the train. Hope held on very tight as they dismounted and ran down the stone mound. Randy went back and retrieved the box before they made their way to the trees. He wasn't sure how far they'd come from the Institute, but he didn't want to take any chances. Keeping themselves parallel to the tracks, Randy and Hope moved through the woods, walking toward the front of the train. It was the only lead Randy had to civilization. There was no telling how far from anything they were. If the people who had rescued him wanted to fling him into the middle of nowhere in an effort to throw the Institute off his trail, they'd succeeded. Randy was surprised that the train hadn't stopped before dawn somewhere along the way, but that detail was something he thought the scientists that had rescued him probably coordinated. Then he started to do math in his head, calculating the average speed of a freight train and how many miles it might be able to cover in a night. Their situation reminded him of a corny grade school math problem. He wasn't an expert on trains, but he figured they were somewhere between 400 and 500 miles away, depending on a variety of variables. If it was a straight shot, he might have been able to pinpoint where they were, but traveling by rail, he didn't have the slightest idea. There was an opening in the tree line ahead, and Randy could see glimpses of the train yard the train had pulled into. He went to it, peeked his head out, and looked around. There was a road not far from them that ran along the front of the train yard. Still moving through the trees, Randy walked toward it. When he got to the edge of the trees that sat along the road, he paused. He wanted to keep a low profile, and surely walking into town with a chimp on his back wasn't the way to do it. Randy kneeled and opened the box he was carrying. He took the snacks and put some of them in his pockets. He'd already pocketed the cash. Then he pulled Hope from his back and wrapped her in the blanket. It draped around her face and made her look like she was wearing a little cloak. Randy couldn't help but tickle her chin. She buried her face in her hands, and Randy smiled. They walked for a little while past the train yard along the edge of the road. A few cars went by, all with different state license plates. For the most part, they didn't seem to be too close to any towns or houses. Just the road, the train yard, and the trees are all Randy had to go off of. Then, up ahead, he saw a green road sign that read, Rutherford, 3 miles. At first, he thought of Rutherford, New Jersey, but he'd been to New Jersey, and this didn't feel like that. Randy turned around to look at a road sign meant for cars traveling east. At the top, it read, Philadelphia, 102 miles. They were walking toward a town he had never heard of, Rutherford, Pennsylvania. Eventually, Randy started to see the town on the horizon. Off in the distance, he also saw what looked like a motel sign by the side of the road. As he walked on, he decided that it would probably be best to stop there and get his bearings. He crossed the road to the side it was on, and after another quarter-mile or so, he'd probably be able to tell if it was still in business. As he approached, with the sound of the train yard far behind, he could now hear faint sounds of the small town. The motel looked like most roadside motels that sat on the outskirts of small towns across America. To Randy's relief, it didn't look too run down. He could handle a few cigarette burns in the blankets after his last 2 nights. Hope jumped out of her blanket and fell to the ground. Randy called out in a panic, "Girl, you gotta get back up here." Hope had to relieve herself, and Randy was happy she'd decided to jump down to do so. When she finished, he scooped her back up and cradled her in the blanket again. He realized he'd have to find a place for her to wait while he checked into a room. They'd fooled the few cars that passed by wrapping Hope in the blanket, but Randy was pretty sure that ruse wouldn't work on the hotel clerk. He plopped Hope down outside in a small patch of trees by the motel, opened a granola bar, and handed it to her. "Wait right here. I won't be long." Randy patted her on the head and headed to the motel front desk. Luckily, they took cash, and after filling out some paperwork with the alias he'd created for himself, Matthew Underhill, he got his key and walked back outside. When he made it back to the patch of trees, Hope was gone. He immediately felt stupid for leaving her out there, and he began to look around frantically. Then, from up above, he heard rustling. Hope had climbed up one of the trees and was dangling from a low hanging branch. Randy reached up, took her hand, and pulled her down to his arms. He wrapped her back in the blanket and went to their room. The inside had all of the amenities you'd expect: a small TV, an ironing board, and a landline phone. He wanted to call his parents, hear their voices, and know that they were safe, but knew that would undoubtedly lead the Institute right to him, and them right to their graves. Randy knew too much, and if he called them, they'd know too much. He and Hope would need to figure something out on their own. Randy closed the blinds as Hope jumped onto one of the 2 beds and bounced lightly on the mattress. He opened another granola bar and handed it to her. Then she followed him to the sink. He filled it with water, and she drank. Randy had enough cash for about a week's stay at the motel. After that, they'd need to find a new place to stay. Now that they weren't running, and things were more calm, Randy could collect his thoughts. He felt far less wavy after he made some coffee in the room's tiny coffee machine. It tasted better than he thought it would. Hope curled up on the bed. He wondered how she would be if he left her in the room for a little while. Then he remembered her living situation before this one, a glass cube. Randy figured their room probably felt like a mansion to her compared to that. So many unanswered questions about what had happened at the Institute went through his mind. The green, illuminated eyes of the man he'd operated on flashed in his head. The chip he'd implanted into the man's brain must have been some kind of mind control device, he thought. He wondered what else he'd been lied to about, and what he wasn't allowed to know. One thing he did know is that when he inserted the chip, the subject snapped out of the state he was in and went into a rage. It was undoubtedly a prototype, and that man was the guinea pig. Randy was caught in the wake of some new experimentation. He was like Oppenheimer behind a protective wall as the atomic bomb went off, only he didn't know where the bomb came from or what it was capable of, and there was no wall. Again, he felt used. Whoever coordinated the experiment didn't care that he and his partner had been put directly in harm's way, and he was starting to think that maybe they were meant to be. He did know too much, after all. He thought about the general. His coercive commands rang out in his mind. Randy shuddered. In hindsight, he wished he'd pretended to be interested in the experiment. Then he could have potentially found out some of the answers to his questions. He didn't blame himself too much for that, though. His emotions and adrenaline were high, and he wasn't thinking of those things just after bringing another human back to life. Now he felt guilty and mad. He wanted to go back to the Institute and set all of the test subjects free, like he'd been. He wanted to join up with the scientists that had gotten him out. How long before they're found out? He thought. They were brave, but with how sophisticated the Institute was, it was only a matter of time before they were found out, and probably not much time. And whatever the Institute was doing with their chips, he needed to stop that too. Right now, though, he was just a runaway, with a one-legged chimp, in a budget motel. Randy grabbed the pen and the small pad of paper sitting on the nightstand. He started to write a to-do list on it. Making lists helped him think and clear his head. He folded it and put it in his pocket. Then he stood up and twisted the rod that opened the stained yellow blinds just a bit. Randy peered out and noticed something across the street. He'd seen the outside of it when they walked to the motel, but was too preoccupied looking for a temporary hiding place for Hope to pay too much attention. He could tell it was a scrapyard now, surrounded by a tall fence made from a rusty patchwork of tin. There was a small sign out front that read, Reggie's Scrapyard. Randy opened a few more snacks from the box and turned the TV to a nature documentary that Hope seemed immediately captivated by. I won't be too long. Can you hold down the fort for me? She sat on the bed, staring into the TV, munching on a bag of nuts. He didn't feel super comfortable leaving her alone in the motel room, but he didn't have many options. Randy closed the blinds and snuck out the door. It had become cloudy, and the air was moist. The grayness of the sky matched the grayness of the motel parking lot. His first order of business would be to head to the grocery store and get some supplies. He walked to the street and got a closer look at the scrapyard on the other side. It was a little hard to tell exactly how big it was, but off in the distance, towering over the fence, Randy could see piles of cars stacked up and mountains of scrap. He wondered what all was inside. Certainly, there were things he could use for his plans against the Institute. As he walked down the street, toward the town, there was another business that interested him, next to the scrapyard. It was a little beige brick building with a sign on the top that read, Jake's Computer Supply and Repair. It looked like it could have been a pawn shop or a small thrift store at one time. It also looked closed. Not for the day, but for good. Randy kept walking about a mile until he made it to Rutherford's grocery store, appropriately named Rutherford Market. Randy was familiar with small towns, having grown up in one, and this one was adding to the homesickness he already felt. He bought his supplies along with a camo hat that he hoped would help him keep a low profile. Before he started walking back to the motel, he stopped in a tiny corner store that had red flannel shirts hanging on its one clothing rack. He bought one to add to his disguise. He didn't know what to expect when he returned to the motel, but to his surprise, Hope was asleep, wrapped in the blanket Randy had carried her in. She may have been more exhausted than he was, but there was no way he would be able to sleep with everything on his mind. Randy turned the volume down on the TV and walked back outside. It sprinkled just a little as he made his way to the scrapyard. He crossed the street, walked up a short set of plywood stairs, and pushed the door to the scrapyard office open. 2 tones rang out, alerting whoever was working that someone had entered. There was a muffler and 2 matching rims sitting on the floor. Randy could smell cigarette smoke and exhaust fumes blowing in from an opened side door. He walked up and peeked behind the counter at the front desk. All of the things he expected to be there were receipts, an outdated computer, some pens and papers, and an ashtray half full of butts. There was also something he didn't expect on the desk, sitting on the side almost out of view. 3 trophies. One was a golden laptop, opened, with strings of code on its screen, similar to a softball or baseball trophy a kid might get in grade school. The second was another computer that looked like it was made of clear crystal. It had an inscription on the base that was too far to read, but it was clearly some kind of award. The third was simple, yet elegant. It was another crystal trophy, but this one had a tint of blue. It swirled upward like a DNA strand, and at the top there was a sphere that had intricate swirling patterns etched into it. There was a dusty, framed senior picture next to them. The teenager in it looked genuinely happy, not fake picture happy. Something about those trophies and that cheap frame holding the face of that smiling teenager made Randy feel uneasy. Randy heard someone approach the side door and leaned back away from the desk. The man who walked through reminded him of his father. He looked like the type of guy who was proud to work and ready to help. Although his smile was genuine, like the picture of the kid on the desk, there was a soft tinge of pain beneath it. We've all smiled like that before, hiding pain that we'd rather not have others see. "Are you Dennis?" the man said, wiping his oil-stained hands on his overalls. Randy was confused, and he must have looked it. "You're not Dennis. Sorry, he was supposed to be here around 2. What can I do you for?" Randy knew what he wanted, but he didn't know how to ask for it. He wanted to look through the scrapyard to see if there was anything he could use to get his plans underway. "Could I just maybe look around for some stuff?" He realized how stupid that sounded as soon as he said it. Socializing, especially with strangers, had never been his strongest suit. The man on the other side of the counter sat and lit a cigarette. "And what exactly were you looking for? Tubing, wire, electrical, mechanical?" "Kind of a little bit of everything," Randy replied, trying to sound as natural as possible. The man exhaled his cigarette smoke and looked Randy up and down. To him, Randy's new clothes looked like a cheap Halloween costume on a kid who was in it exclusively for the candy, rushed and unnatural. Randy thought he did look natural, but his years of working in an underground science environment had more than skewed his perception of the small-town working man. "A little bit of everything," the man repeated, taking another drag from his cigarette. Just then, they heard a truck pull up out front. It definitely sounded like it had problems. "That'll be Dennis," the man at the front desk said. Dennis popped his head through the front door. "Can you come out here and take a look at this, Reggie? I thought I knew what I needed when I called, but on the way over, she started acting like she never acted before." "I'll be right out," Reggie replied. He looked at Randy with an expression and an upward-turned hand gesture that said, "I don't really know how this guy knows me, but I'm going to help him anyway." He walked past Randy and gave him a light squeeze on the shoulder. "Give me just a sec. I'll be right back." Randy was the curious type. He'd also been one to fix a broken radio, build a functioning robot, or mount cannons on a motorbike. He may have lost his sense of small-town fashion, but he hadn't forgotten the small-town code of ethics he was raised on. A piece of that code pertained to the situation he'd found himself in. If someone's vehicle was busted and you just stood there, doing nothing, you weren't worth the shoes on your feet. He figured maybe if he could help Reggie with Dennis's truck problem, he'd gain his respect, and Reggie might be more apt to give him a tour of the scrapyard. Luckily for Randy, Dennis's truck was the same make and model as his dad's back home, one he knew inside and out. Smoke was bellowing from the inside of the hood as Dennis popped it. "Yep, I'd say this is a lot worse than you thought it was on the phone, but I'm not a mechanic. You'll have to take it down to Mike's shop," Reggie said. Dennis waved the lingering smoke away from the engine. "Mike's just going to either send me here or come over here himself to get what he needs. Let's just cut out the middleman, Reggie." Randy spoke up. "If I had to guess, based on the year of the truck and the way it sounded when you pulled up, you've got a leak in cylinder 4 that's creating a loss of compression, which is typically to blame for decreased performance and loss of power." The two men looked over at Randy, bemused. There was silence for a time. Then Dennis looked back at Reggie and asked, "And what do you think?" Reggie's eyes snapped to the engine. "I think the kid's right." Dennis looked at Randy again, who was now feeling a small sense of pride, and then back to Reggie. "You got what I need then?" "I might. Come take a peek," Reggie said. He walked past the truck and nodded at Randy in the direction of the gate he was headed toward. The scrapyard was indeed huge. It was a sprawling field of towering metal, old cars, appliances, broken machines, and tons of other forgotten and discarded pieces of technology. Dennis and Randy followed Reggie across the yard to a patch of rusty trucks. Reggie looked back at Randy and said, "Go ahead and look around while I find this thing for his truck, kid." Randy, soaking everything in, said, "Thanks, I won't be long." "We might be," Reggie replied. "Take as much time as you need, but be careful. Meet me up front when you're done." Randy walked around the yard, making a mental inventory of all the things he might need. There were tons of things he could use that could help him against the Institute, but there were tons of things he'd still need, too. He wished the computer store next to the salvage yard was still open. That would have solved some of his problems. He'd also need a workshop or lab with tools to work on the things he planned to build. Then he remembered something his dad used to say. The secret to getting ahead is getting started. It was a quote that stuck in the back of his mind all the way until grade school, where he saw it printed on an inspirational poster in his teacher's room. After looking up its origins in the computer lab that year, he learned that there was more to the quote, which was written by Mark Twain. The secret to getting ahead is getting started. The secret to getting started is breaking up your complex, overwhelming tasks into small, manageable tasks and starting on the first one. After some time walking around the yard, Randy headed back to the front desk. Dennis was pulling away in his screeching banshee of a truck when Randy went up the wooden stairs. The two-tone ding sounded again as he passed the threshold. Reggie was sitting behind the desk again, lighting another cigarette. "Find anything your boss might need?" he asked, tucking his cigarette pack in his front overall pocket. Randy walked over and put a hand on the counter. He paused for a moment, then asked, "Is the computer store next door closed? Like closed? Reggie's eyes moved to the edge of his desk, at the framed picture and 3 trophies. Then he looked up at Randy. "That was my son's store. He doesn't work there anymore. I thought you were looking for scrap anyway." Randy, reminding himself that he was still undercover and needed to be cautious, replied, "Yeah, boss needs all kinds of stuff, always sending me out. I think the thing he needs most is his head checked." Then he chuckled. He had never been a great liar, and he was an even worse actor. Reggie leaned in and put his freshly lit cigarette out. "And who is your boss?" he asked, sounding slightly irritated now. Randy, fortunately, had made a small character chart for Matthew Underhill in his mind. He worked a few towns over, and his boss, a machinist opening a new shop, had gotten himself in over his head. Now Randy was his gopher, out on the prowl for things they needed to get the ball rolling. Randy thought it was an imaginative, believable character. Reggie did not. "Where is your son? Maybe we could talk wholesale on a few things I need," Randy asked. Reggie looked Randy directly in the eyes and squinted. Then he said, "My son's dead." Then there was silence. Randy heard a car pass outside. The sound of its blaring country music drifted and faded as it went out of earshot. I'm sorry, I didn't know," Randy said. "How would you?" Reggie replied. "It's not like it's on the sign out there." "I know, but I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's been a few years. Time helps. Drinking used to, but it don't really no more." He sighed and looked back at the picture of his son. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this. I guess you just kind of look like him." Randy looked at the picture and realized that they did share a resemblance. Red hair, pointed chin. "I didn't want to get rid of it after he passed," Reggie said. "Someday, maybe I'll sort through it, see what it's all worth. That little building was originally just storage, but he was so damn good with computers that we set that shop up for him when he was just 15. It was his little workshop where he'd tinker around. I never got into stuff like that, but it's what he liked, so we let him have it. I never understood any of it, but we were so proud of him either way." He picked up the shorter crystal trophy and blew the dust off of it. "No one around here really asks about it. When it was open, he sold or traded online, but that world is a whole different world to me." He extended his arms and passed them through the air behind him, exalting his scrapyard kingdom. "This is more my speed." Then he stood up, looked at Randy, and said, "Let's go see if there's anything over there your boss might need." They went next door, and Reggie shuffled a few keys on his large key ring. He found the one he needed and unlatched the deadbolt and doorknob locks on the door to the beige building. Reggie let Randy in, and they walked into the back room that he unlocked with another key. Randy's eyes widened as he walked in. This was no simple computer repair store. Reggie's son had been building an extremely high-tech laboratory. Robotic arms sat on the desks. There was a 3D printer that looked like it had stopped halfway through printing a piece of lab equipment. Holographic interface emitters, similar to the ones Randy used at the Institute, were mounted on several desks. There were also a plethora of other devices and pieces of technology that reminded him of the Institute scattered about the lab. "This is where he kept his gadgets," Reggie said, clearly not realizing the underwhelming nature of his comment. Randy looked around in awe and then asked, "Where did your son learn to do all this?" Reggie slid his finger through some dust on a nearby table and said, "He was always smart. A lot smarter than me. Or his mom. You didn't have to be around him for more than 5 minutes to tell he was weird, but he was the smart kind of weird. People liked him. They didn't always understand him. He built most of the stuff in here, or at least that's what he told me. He was always ordering stuff off the internet, too. That's where he found out about the damn college he went to out east, too." That last comment startled Randy. "College out east?" he asked. "Yeah," Reggie replied. "Out in Massachusetts. I wish for the love of God he hadn't found out about it." Randy didn't want to ask his next question. He felt like it was ridiculous to ask anyway. There were tons of colleges all across America and the world. Massachusetts alone probably had over 100. It wasn't safe to ask, and everything inside of him was telling him not to. But he had to. "Was it in Boston?" Randy asked, still an innocent enough question, not letting on to anything. "Yeah," Reggie replied, with a tinge of apprehension in his voice. Randy inhaled, sat on a spinning chair by one of the desks, and asked what he knew he shouldn't. He asked if Reggie's son had gone to the institute he'd just escaped from. Randy wished the silence would have been broken again by blaring country music. It wasn't. He turned and looked up at Reggie, who now looked angry and confused. "How the fuck do you know about that?" Reggie asked between his teeth. I... Randy didn't know what else to do. He didn't want to compromise his plans or his safety or Reggie's safety or hopes, but he didn't know what to say. "I used to go there, and they trapped me. They're doing terrible things, experiments, but I escaped. And now I'm on the run with a one-legged chimp, and we need to find a..." Reggie cut him off. "Who put you up to this? What kind of bullshit story is that? Escaped with a one-legged chimp? Prank's over, kid. Get the hell out, now." Randy didn't know what to say again. In a flash, everything he needed was falling into his lap like a serendipitous fairy tale. And then it was ripped away just as soon as it had arrived. "If Jake's mom was still alive, you'd have to answer to the wrath of a fiery redhead for this. You're lucky I'm more patient than she was. I thought the days of Jake getting bullied were over. High school doesn't end for some people, though, does it? The lowest of people. Fucking scum. Now get out before I really lose my temper." Randy walked out of the lab and to the front door. "If I ever see you back here..." Reggie's voice quivered a bit, and he had tears in his eyes. "I'll put you in the fucking scrapyard like the trash you are." Randy crossed the street and quickly walked back to the motel. He was right back where he started. No leads, no hope, he thought. Hope! Randy hadn't forgotten about her, but he had surely left her to her own devices for far too long. He fumbled in his pocket for the door key, found it, and went inside the room. This time, she had torn down the shower curtain and ripped small pieces of it to add to her bed nest. It seemed she had gone to the bathroom, only in the tub. Randy turned on the spray head and rinsed it down the drain, then decided it was probably time to take Hope back to the patch of trees he had left her at when he checked in before she left a mess that wouldn't be as easy to clean. He wrapped her in her blanket and took her to do her business. Randy stood guard and decided to let her play a little in the trees while he thought. There only seemed to be one other car in the motel parking lot, which most likely belonged to the person at the front desk. He needed to find a way to convince Reggie that he wasn't lying about his story. Not only that, he'd need to do it before Reggie told anyone else what had happened in his son's lab. That story would surely spread quickly in a town as small as Rutherford. Hope made a short, cheeping sound from the tree and jumped down into his lap. She buried her head in his chest, and Randy realized what his next move should be. The two tones rang out again as Randy stepped into Reggie's shop. "We're closed," he said without looking up. He was pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "Hi," Randy replied. Reggie recognized his voice and looked up from the drink he was pouring. "You! I told you, stay the heck—" He noticed the swaddled blanket in Randy's arms and stopped. Looking confused, he sat the bottle of whiskey on the desk. Randy walked up to the counter, unswaddled Hope, and sat her on it. She began to play with one of the pins sticking out of the pin holder next to her. Reggie stared at her with his mouth slightly agape. Then he looked at Randy and said, "Shit." He pulled another glass from under his desk and began to pour. Hope was content, munching on a bag of barbecue chips from Reggie's desk. Randy sniffed the whiskey and took a sip. He'd never been much of a drinker, but considering the circumstances, he figured, why not? "Sorry I said what I said," Reggie began. "But you gotta understand, that place took everything from me. Jake was smart. Not only that, he was careful. Even when he was a toddler, he never climbed on things or took any big risks. When he was a kid, he wasn't like the others. He never rode his bike off ramps or jumped into the river. It was hell getting him to use a knife to cut his food. That's why when his college called to tell his mother and me that he'd passed, it didn't set right with me. They said he'd forgotten to put safety measures in place before he started an experiment, and that there was a malfunction, an explosion. That wasn't Jake. That wasn't like him at all. Worst part was, we never got his body. They said it burnt up. His mom never could get over that." Reggie took a sip of whiskey and turned to look at a picture of his wife that Randy hadn't noticed from the front of the counter. "She couldn't get over that, and she couldn't get over the thought of him not coming home, of not being able to say goodbye." Reggie slammed a fist onto the desk and started to pour himself another drink. Hope jumped into Randy's lap, startled. Randy knew social skills were never his strong point, but he knew that this wasn't a moment to ask for details. Reggie continued. "And after she passed, I just kept working. I didn't know what else to do. I needed to find a way to keep going. So I crawled up inside this fucking scrapyard," and he looked at the bottle in his hand, "and up inside this bottle and tried to forget." He took another large swig from his glass and blew his nose on a red handkerchief that he pulled from his pocket. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this. Maybe because you kind of look like Jake. Maybe because I've tried to forget it all, but now, how could I? You walk in here with a monkey, plop it on the counter, and say you came from the same school Jake went to. Did you know him? Did you work with him? How the hell did you wind up here? I never got a lick of answers from that damn school. So if you know something, please tell me." Randy stroked the hair on the back of Hope's head and took another sip from his glass. Then he proceeded to tell Reggie everything, sparing no details. "What are the odds you wind up here, huh?" Reggie asked after Randy finished. The question was hypothetical, but Randy had actually calculated the odds. Reggie sat, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "You know, I've seen every James Bond movie. That general sounds worse than any asshole Bond ever fought." He went to the side door, propped it open, and lit another cigarette. "This doesn't seem real, or feel real. It's like a movie, but a lot of the stuff that Jake used to make never felt real either." Reggie took a long pull from the cigarette and blew the smoke out the door. "I know how to get back in," Randy said. "I know how their security systems work. I feel..." He looked down at Hope and then back at Reggie. "Guilty for not doing something sooner. I should have known what I was doing, but I never imagined it was going to end in some kind of sci-fi mind control scenario. I wanted to help and thought that I was, but I was only making things worse. I didn't know Jake, but he probably would have wanted to put a stop to this too. If I had to guess, he probably knew too much and tried to." Reggie stared at Hope and took another pull from his cigarette. "I want to help too," he said, "but I also want to make them pay." It didn't matter whether it was compassion or revenge that fueled Reggie. Randy was happy to have him back on his side. "I want in," Reggie said. "You can use whatever you need from the yard and Jake's shop, but I want to be there when you go back." Randy had already worked out a plan in his head. That plan didn't involve another person, but if it meant access to the yard and lab, he'd figure it out. After listening to what happened to his son, he thought Reggie deserved some closure as well. Reggie hung a sign on the front of the scrapyard that read, "Closed. On vacation." Randy wasted no time and started going to work in Jake's old lab. Their plan had two objectives: free the test subjects and take down the Institute. If Randy could figure out what the chip was, that would be a plus as well. Hope was delighted to have the scrapyard as her own personal playground during the day while Randy worked. Randy was able to 3D print things he needed in the lab, and the things he couldn't, he made out of discarded machine parts Reggie fetched from the scrapyard. The first thing he built was a replica of the glass tube he'd been smuggled out in. It looked and functioned just as the others had. The new plan was to have Reggie smuggle Randy back into the Institute with it. A few weeks passed as Randy toiled away in the lab. The spark from his welders stayed in his eyes, and the smell of his soldering iron lingered on the clothes Reggie let him borrow. He was able to fit Hope with a new bionic leg. Instead of an implanted one, he designed one that worked with her existing leg and operated non-invasively. It was like the limb of a mech suit. A bionic enhancement, strong and durable. It shouldn't have been at the top of his list of priorities, but it was. Her missing leg was a constant reminder of the things he had done, the guilt he had from working in the lab. It was a massive distraction, and making her new leg helped him focus. It also gave him an idea. If he and Reggie were going to fight the Institute, they wouldn't stand a chance unless they had something that could stand up to a barrage of bullets and waves of whatever sophisticated weapons the Institute security undoubtedly had. Randy didn't know exactly what those might be, as he never had a reason to rouse security, but he did remember the general carrying some kind of weapon on his hip. It didn't look like an ordinary pistol. It was sleek and chrome, if he had to guess. Based on a series of energy experiments he had done there last year, that pistol was a weaponized reflection of his research. The Institute had more, and probably bigger, more powerful ones. Hope's new leg inspired Randy to build streamlined mech suits that would fit over them. They used liquid nanotechnology and could be turned on and off via voice command. When Randy ran over to the scrapyard and up to Reggie with a ruler taking a variety of measurements, Reggie stood still and extended his arms. "Do I want to know?" he asked. Randy clicked the tablet he was carrying, and a holographic prototype of the suit he was designing floated above it. Reggie stared at it as it turned in the air. "You are like Jake," he said. "I wish you would have never found them." Randy clicked the tablet and the hologram faded. He replied, "If he hadn't found them, they would have found him. It's not his fault, and it's not your fault. Nothing you did or didn't do would have changed that, Reggie. I gotta get back to work." Randy ran off, back to the computer lab. Tears welled in Reggie's eyes as he smiled. A few more days passed. Hope swung through the scrapyard, enjoying her new appendage. Reggie sifted through a pile of old machines, looking for specific pieces of metal that Randy needed to be melted down for raw materials. The 3D printer in Jake's lab could make just about anything, but it needed the input material to do so. "It's like a replicator from Star Trek," Randy said, trying to explain how it worked to Reggie. Reggie was more familiar with James Bond than Star Trek. "It's like we're Bond, going into the supervillain's lair. The general guy sounds a lot like General Orlov from Octopussy to me." Randy hadn't seen the film, but he nodded, flipped his soldering glasses back down, and continued to work. That night, as they hovered over Chinese takeout in Jake's lab, Randy slid a small, clear circle across the table to Reggie. "That's an earpiece," he said. "If we get separated in there, this will keep us in contact." Then he pulled a black rectangular object about the size of a remote control out of his pocket. "Be careful with this. It's kind of like a phaser." He raised his eyebrows and tilted his head forward to see if Reggie understood the reference. Reggie raised his eyebrows and nodded. Randy continued. He clicked the side once and said, "Stun. That goes for humans and robots both." Then he clicked it a second time. "Really, really stun." Then a third. And kill. Reggie's brow furrowed at the mention of the phaser's last setting. "Look, I don't really know what we're up against," Randy said. "Things can move really quickly at the Institute. They might have an army of machines or animals or maybe people. Let's try to keep this thing set to stun, but that third option's there if we absolutely need it." Reggie nodded and took a bite of soy-soaked broccoli. The day finally came. Randy briefed Reggie on how to use the rest of the inventions he'd made for him. Reggie was most impressed by the exosuit. Randy and Hope watched as he said, "Suit, activate." The suit quickly shot from his belt, like a liquid, covering his entire body. It was a stark contrast to see Reggie go from oil-stained overalls to smooth, glistening white. Randy made himself and Hope exosuits as well. He figured if Reggie had his reasons to fight the Institute, Hope probably did too. Plus, the glass tube he'd made was virtually indestructible. If things got too hairy, he planned to put her there. Reggie and Randy loaded their van. It was white and inconspicuous. Reggie made the extra effort to make it look new and polished, as close as possible to the type of van Randy had described being rescued in. It was early afternoon when they left. The eastern Pennsylvania countryside was beautiful. "I still can't believe all those little metal squares in your backpack are robots," Reggie said as he flicked his cigarette ash out the window. "Yeah," Randy said. "They're small, but they're powerful. Jake actually made the prototypes. I just finished what he started." Reggie smiled at that. "In a way," Randy continued, "Jake will be fighting with us." Reggie exhaled a plume of smoke out the window and twirled his hand in the air. "Beam me up, Scotty." His reference didn't really apply to what they were talking about, but Randy entertained it anyway, replying with a Vulcan hand gesture and saying, "Live long and prosper." They both started to laugh as their van rolled through the mountains. By the time they made it to Boston, it was dark. That was part of the plan, in an effort to stay inconspicuous. The van approached the Institute. On the surface, it looked like a harmless college or campus for higher learning. It's a disguise for the sinister experiments going on beneath, Randy thought. They drove to the parking garage that sat above Randy's former lab. If Randy's guess was correct, they'd be able to get in through an elevator he'd taken many times before. As fast as things changed at the Institute before he was rescued, and with the general there making things worse, Randy wasn't sure what new or different security measures they'd have to get past. He'd never had a reason to break security protocols or go against their systems before, but he knew how they worked. Randy handed Reggie a small reflective disc. "I'll be able to walk you through this with your earpiece, but when we get in the elevator, this will be our ticket down." Randy double-checked Reggie's exosuit belt and his phaser, then leaned back on the table that was sitting in the van with Hope in his arms. A glass arch formed over top of them and faded to black. Reggie's earpiece clicked on. "Test?" It crackled slightly, then stabilized. "It'll sound clearer when I'm out of the tube." Reggie wheeled Randy and Hope out of the back of the van, and the tube began to hover over the table. Reggie walked them into the elevator, and the doors shut behind them. The elevator was meant for the students actually attending the college, but with the proper clearance, the labs below were accessible. "Hold the disc up to the faceplate," Randy said in Reggie's ear. He did, and light shot from it. The faceplate slid down, and a hologram began to project from the disc. It was projecting an incredibly fast sequence of faces. A few moments went by, and then a voice made an announcement from an unseen speaker. "Face recognition sequence timing out in 3. Reggie heard Randy in his ear again. "Damn!" The voice rang out. 2. The hologram was still shifting through countless faces. "What do we do?" Reggie cried. Then the elevator made a pleasant ding sound and shot downward. Reggie put the disc in his pocket and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "We're definitely on camera, Randy," Reggie said. "They're not seeing what's happening," Randy replied. "I'm giving their system a false feed. They're not seeing anything out of the ordinary." The elevator doors opened and they stepped out into a stale, white hallway. This one was similar to the one Randy had walked down many times in the past, only it had a security checkpoint. Randy looked through the glass tube at the guards sitting at the checkpoint. He felt proud that the lab coat he'd made Reggie didn't give them away to the guard at first glance. Reggie started talking to Randy through the side of his mouth, trying to make it seem like he wasn't a lunatic talking to himself. "This guy's going to want some kind of badge or credentials." "The disc should work for this, too," Randy replied. Reggie approached the guard and then stopped as he made a halt gesture with his hand. He barked, "Lab badge." Reggie walked a little closer to the guard and held out the disc. To Reggie's surprise, a hologram of his own head projected from it and swirled in the air. The hologram also had a few rows of information illuminated beneath his head. The guard pulled out a similar-looking disc and scanned Reggie's hologram. His disc flashed red, and a deep error tone buzzed in the air. Reggie wasn't familiar with any of this technology, but even he knew what was happening. The guard squinted his eyes, pulled his disc back, and tried to scan the hologram again. The error tone sounded again, and the guard slowly looked up at Reggie. Reggie said, "Worked earlier this morning." The guard's expression told Reggie all he needed to know. He wasn't buying it. As fast as he could, and before the guard could raise his rifle, Reggie pulled his phaser from his side and fired it at the guard. An electrified beam of purple shot from the weapon. It hit the guard, and arches of electricity pulsed around his entire body. He fell to the ground. Reggie stood, frozen. He knew it was just a stun, but he'd never shot anyone before. Randy called out in his ear, "Next time, activate your suit before you do anything like that. Grab his rifle and his disc, quick. I don't know how much longer my false security feed will hold." Reggie pulled the items from the guard, noticing his rifle was like no other weapon he'd ever seen before. It was made of smooth, reflective metal and didn't appear to have a trigger. "Push the two discs together," Randy said. Reggie did, and watched as a beam of light shot from the guard's disc to his. "We have his credentials now," Randy said. Reggie presented his disc to a circle that sat next to the sliding glass doors the guard was patrolling. The doors opened, and they walked through. They were in another long, white hallway, lit with uncomfortable fluorescent lights. "Jesus, how deep is this rabbit hole?" Reggie asked. "You have no idea," Randy replied. Then he directed Reggie to the fourth door on the left. Reggie hurried down, and they slipped inside. Randy knew where they were headed, but Reggie didn't. He gasped as they entered. The room was huge, and glass cubes were lined and stacked all along its walls. They all contained chimps with varying degrees of cybernetic enhancements and biological mutations. Some had robotic arms, some had extra arms and legs, and some had fully cybernetic heads where their natural heads should have been. Most of them screamed and jumped as they entered, but the room was eerily quiet. Their sounds didn't pass through their glass prisons. Sitting on the floor, in front of the cubes, in rows, laid out like a military brigade, there were many black glass cubes that looked like the one Randy and Hope were inside of. Randy opened his tube and swung his feet onto the smooth white floor. Hope sat up on the table and started to look around the room. She started to scream and jump up and down frantically. Then she leapt from the table, onto one of the glass tubes. She leapt onto another and continued down the line of tubes like a frog jumping across lily pads. "Hope!" Randy called out. Reggie was still shocked by what he saw. Randy flung his backpack over his shoulder and ran to Hope, who had just jumped to the floor. She was staring into one of the glass cubes. It had a full-grown chimp inside that had one cybernetic leg and arm, both on opposite sides. It also had some kind of lens grafted to one of its eyes. When it saw Hope, it stopped jumping and placed a hand on the glass. Hope approached the cube and put her hand against it on the other side of the chimp's hand. Reggie, who had now walked up behind Randy, said, "They know each other." The larger chimp leaned down and placed its face next to Hope, fogging up the glass. Hope screamed out. The larger chimp wiped the fog away, and Hope calmed again. "I'm not a scientist, but I'm pretty sure that's her mama," Reggie said. Randy asked for the disc, and Reggie handed it to him. He held it up to the panel on the side of the door, then clicked a series of glowing buttons on the side panel. The door of the cube slid open, and Hope rushed into her mother's arms. It reminded Randy of how she'd burrowed into his chest before. Hope's mother turned to look at Randy and snarled. Her eyes began to glow green. She sat Hope aside and lunged at him. Hope screamed and jumped into Randy's arms. Her mother stopped, realizing that Hope was safe. Hope slid her hand back and forth over Randy's arm, showing her mother that he was a friend. Randy kneeled and slowly reached out to Hope's mother. Her breathing calmed as he placed a hand on her shoulder. Reggie was leaning over one of the black glass tubes, staring at his reflection. It seemed to float in the void of the glass. He hoped his son sat beneath one of the tubes. He called over to Randy. "We need to get these open." Randy, remembering the experiment he'd done on the man and how it had made him violent and unpredictable, said, "I wish we could, but trust me, that's not a good idea." "I thought the idea was to rescue them," Reggie said, now slightly annoyed. "It is," Randy said, "but we don't know what they've been through or what kind of state they're in. Some of them might be worse off than them." He pointed to the glass cubes surrounding them. "We can't just start opening them up." Reggie understood. "Let's stick to the plan. They'll be easier to get out of here in tubes, and they'll be safer under the glass." "Right," Reggie replied. Randy walked over to a terminal desk that sat near the entrance of the room. Hope and her mother followed. He held up the disk and unlocked the terminal. He pulled up the surveillance feed of the room they were in and was thankful to see that his cloaking code was still keeping them hidden. Then he switched the feed to the hallway outside the room. Alarmed, he whispered to Reggie's earpiece, "There are 2 guards outside, Reggie. Get under the glass." Reggie's eyes shot to the door, then to the table he'd wheeled in. He jumped on it, and the black glass encased him. Randy didn't know what to do about the opened cube and loose Chimp. Before the door slid open, he dove below the terminal desk and pulled Hope and her mother down with him. The guards both came into the room carrying rifles similar to the one Reggie now had from the previous guard. Randy was able to project a smaller version of the terminal's interface from his disk. He began scanning through the charts of the people in the glass tubes. Both of the guards were lost in conversation. "I'm not saying I'm going to post it again. I'm just saying if someone was going to call me out on it like that again, I might," one of the guards said. "You won't," the other replied. "You wouldn't either." "Pfft, whatever." They continued to walk across the room, heading toward a door on the other side. One of them noticed the open cube and put his arm over the chest of the other. They both stopped. "That's supposed to be open?" They both pulled their rifles to their fronts and started to look around the room. One of them spoke into a communication device on his wrist. "We might have a loose subject in Alpha Pin 16, requesting backup." The guards were scanning the room with their rifles drawn, searching for the lost subject. Randy heard Reggie say in his earpiece, "We gotta do something quick, kid." "Hang tight," Randy replied. He found what he was looking for in the files. One of the black tubes sitting in the middle of the room opened. The 2 guards noticed and looked at each other, and then back at the tube. The man who was sitting beneath the glass sat up. The guards aimed their rifles at him. He was bald and had several large scars across the top of his head. Randy pulled one of the metal squares from his backpack and passed it through the hologram that was projecting from the disk. Then he said, "Protect subject." He dropped the square, and it sprouted 6 reflective metal legs. It ran to the man who had awakened and wrapped its legs around his neck. He panicked for just a moment, but then the robot spider covered him in an exosuit, like the ones Randy and Reggie had, sleek and white. He looked down as it continued to cover his arms and hands like a flowing liquid. Then he looked back up at the guards, and his eyes started to glow green. The guards shot green beams of light from their rifles at him. They bounced off the exosuit. The man jumped off the table and into the air at one of the guards. More green energy blasts reflected off his suit, and he landed on top of the guard, pinning him to the ground. The other guard continued to fire, hoping one of the shots could penetrate the suit. Randy breathed in a sigh of relief, seeing that his universal exosuit prototype worked as he'd hoped. His, Reggie's, and Hope's were built specifically for them, but the subject's was a bit more of a wild card in terms of functionality. Randy turned on his exosuit, leaned over, and turned on Hope's. Hope's mother made a loud whining sound at the sight of her daughter being encased in smooth white metal. Her cry caught the attention of the guard who wasn't pinned. He had already backed up from his partner's struggle. He turned and ran over to the terminal to investigate the sound. When he got to the front of it, he didn't see anything. He started to walk around the side of it. Hope's mom reached out before he could come completely around and grabbed him by the testicles. The man screamed and turned his rifle on her. Hope jumped up from under the desk and leapt onto his head. She hung around the front of his neck and bit his nose. He screamed even louder, and he fired a few green shots from his rifle into the air. Hope's mother neutered the man, and he dropped to his knees. Blood gushed from the gaping wound. Randy was shocked. He'd seen gore and blood, but this situation felt a bit different than any he'd been a part of before. The other guard was still pinned by the released subject. His eyes were glowing an even brighter green as he hovered over the guard, pinning him with inhuman strength. His eyes got brighter still, and the pinned guard shouted, "No!" A blast of bright green energy similar to the rifles shot from the freed subject's eyes. The beam went through the pinned man's forehead, leaving a softball-sized hole. The wound was instantly cauterized, and the beam left a sizzling black, charred mark on the floor. Reggie, in a panic, engaged his suit and turned his rifle on the man. The subject jumped up from the floor, and Randy leapt from under the desk. He yelled, "Reggie, stop!" Reggie and the man were both breathing heavily. "He's not under their control." Reggie turned to Randy and yelled, "He sure as hell looks like he is." "He's not," Randy replied. "I went through the files of some of the subjects in here. The chips implanted in some of them don't work on them. This guy's got the chip, and he's obviously been enhanced, but he's the captain of his own ship. They tried to control him, but they haven't had success." Reggie looked into the subject's glowing eyes, and they began to dim. Randy continued, "There are a few others in here that are like him, augmented but not under their control. That's what they were working on the day I stopped. A chip that could keep them all under control." Reggie yelled to the man, "You want to get out?" The man nodded, and the glow in his eyes completely faded. Randy said, "I'm going to let some of the others out, okay?" He typed a series of commands at the terminal, and then 4 more glass tubes opened. Each person that sat up had different augmentations, mutations, and scars. They began to look around, in a panic. Randy stood on the terminal's desk and shouted, "Stay calm. I know we might look like them, but we are not them. We're here to free you, but we've got to act fast, and you have to listen to precisely what I say." One of the test subject's eyes started glowing as he looked in Randy's direction. The man who was freed first went to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. The enraged subject, seeing another subject free and calmed himself. "So the rest of them are under their control? Mindless drones for the Institute?" Reggie asked. "Not all of them," Randy replied. "Some of them, for lack of a better word, are feral." He pointed to some of the thrashing, rambunctious chimps. "The Institute doesn't control them, and they barely control themselves. They probably haven't been terminated because the Institute needs to study them and figure out what went wrong." Reggie shuddered at the thought of his son losing his mind and becoming feral. Randy, Reggie, Hope, and the rest of their newly freed team gathered at the door of the room. The ones that hadn't been were all fitted with exosuits. Randy and Reggie tried not to stare as the liquid metal covered the extra appendages of some of the subjects. "We gotta figure out what happened to Jake," Reggie said. "We will, but right now we have to get out of this room. Those guards asked for backup, and I'm sure they'll be here soon. Also, I'm not sure if my cloaking feed is still active on their security cameras." Hope was now riding her mother's back. They looked eager to get out of that room as well. Randy opened the doors and peeked out into the long white hallway. A ways off, he saw 4 guards running toward the room. Randy pulled his head back and shot a hologram from his disc. It was a floor plan of the level they were on. He took his fingers and expanded the hallway they were in. 2 doors down from here on the right. That's where we'll get some answers." He unhooked his phaser from his side and said, "Let's go." They moved into the hallway, and blasts from the guards' energy rifles began to ping off of their suits. Randy and Reggie were firing their phasers at the guards, hoping to stun them. 2 of them got holes shot through them by the rescued test subjects. They heard the voice of one of the remaining guards shouting for backup as Randy ushered his team into the room they were headed for. Before the door closed, Randy dropped one of the squares from his backpack onto the floor in the hallway. It sprouted legs and ran toward the guards. Then it jumped onto one of their necks and completely covered his head in white liquid metal. Behind the closed doors, Randy pulled the disc from his pocket and began typing a command into a floating keyboard. There was a loud buzz and a red light above the door flashed. "I jammed the door. That'll keep him off us for a little while." Reggie scanned the room. It was smaller than the last room they were in, and it had several desks scattered around. It was plain and white, like the hallway, but much darker. The door buzzed again. "That's just them trying to get in. If we'd waited any longer than we did to come to the Institute, they'd probably have turret rifles and guard robots or tamed test subjects we'd be fighting. Come over here." Randy ran to one of the desks. Reggie followed. Randy took his disc and sat it in the center of the desk. A massive holographic 3-dimensional screen appeared in front of them, and he started sifting through the countless strings of code that appeared. "This is where they store all of the research files," Randy said. "They're on hard disks, not connected to any outside network, so no one can hack the information. Only downside for them is if someone who knows what they're doing gets in here, it's pretty easy to hack a device not connected to a network." "Jake would have loved all this," Reggie said. Randy punched one final keystroke and all of the database files appeared in front of them. Randy found the master collection of subject files and began to scroll down alphabetically. He looked at Reggie, who was leaning in with anticipation. Randy stopped at Jake's name and opened the folder. There were a variety of video files. He scrolled to the most recent one, then looked back at Reggie again. "Are you sure you want to see this?" Randy asked. Reggie's eyes were locked on the hovering file. Without looking away, he said, "Open it." Randy started the video. It was unfortunately what he thought it was going to be, a feed from a scientist's glasses, just like the one he and his partners sent to the General's tablet during their last experiment. And just like that last experiment, it looked all too similar. The only difference was that the man strapped to the table was Reggie's son, Jake. "Jake," Reggie whispered. The experiment played out just like the one Randy and his partner had done. The scientist implanted the chip and Jake lunged upward, breaking the straps that were holding him. Only in this experiment, both straps broke. Jake grabbed the scientist who was capturing the feed they were watching by the throat. He began to pull the scientist toward him. Jake's eyes were glowing green. The scientist struggled and the video shook. Then, an energy weapons blast rang out. Blood splattered the lens of the camera. Randy and Reggie heard a low, steady tone that indicated the subject's, Jake's, heart had stopped. The video stabilized, and the scientist wiped the blood from the lens, then looked down at Jake. Reggie let out a cry at the sight of his dead son. Then the scientist looked to his left. The general was standing there, pointing an energy pistol in his direction. They heard the scientist yell, "You son of a bitch!" He began to run toward the general. There was a flash of green from the general's pistol, and then the feed turned black. They heard the second scientist plead for his life, and then a third shot from the general's weapon. The feed was black, but they heard the general's voice. "Another failure. Call the boss and let him know that the Archtech chip still has a long way to go. Let him know that I need a new..." The audio glitched and then faded to silence. A gray play symbol appeared in the middle of the last black frame. Randy looked over at Reggie. He was staring into the black final frame of the video. He closed his eyes and took a deep, long breath. "I'm so sorry," Randy said. Reggie opened his eyes. "It's okay. I know it's weird, but I actually feel better now. All this time, I just needed to know what happened. I needed answers, and now I have them. I just wish his mother could have had answers. She deserved that." Another series of buzzes rang out from the door to the hallway. Hope's mother, and the rest of their crew had gathered behind them. It wouldn't be long before the Institute made it through the door. Randy thought about what needed done. They got answers about Jake, and he planned on saving all of the test subjects, humans and animals alike. But he wanted more. The world outside of the Institute needed to see what the Institute was doing. They needed to know what they were capable of. Randy needed to warn the public, so nothing like this could ever happen again. "I need to download as much of this as I can," Randy said. He pulled several more discs from his backpack and sat them on top of the one that was in the center of the desk. Then he initialized a full system download from the entire archive. He clicked through a few of the files as the download began. The door buzzed again, and then they started to see a bright spark form on it. The guards were cutting their way in. Reggie looked at the door and the bright white square forming on it. "I don't think it's going to be long before this room is swarming with guards and Lord knows what else. What's our plan here, Randy?" Randy reached in his backpack and pulled out 4 squares. He clicked them on and said, "Barrier Protocol 4. The squares sprouted legs and ran to the door. They climbed up, one on each corner. Their legs drilled into the surface of the door as liquid metal spread from them, covering it entirely. The square of light underneath was covered, but another was beginning to show just beneath the new surface. Randy started sifting through more files as the discs downloaded. He was looking for anything that had to do with something the general said in the video. Archtech. In his whole career at the Institute, he had never heard that name. He found several documents and opened the first one. Randy was thankful at that moment that he had spent several months of his 4th grade summer learning to speed read. It was a skill he practiced often and was happy to have it now. He pored over several pages of documents regarding Archtech and learned that they were actually behind the chips and experiments. They told the Institute they were contracting them for government operations, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. Archtech was an entity all its own, and from what Randy could read, had nothing to do with the U.S. government at all. Over the years, they sunk their claws deeper and deeper into the Institute, funding them while simultaneously using them for their own nefarious experiments. Randy wanted to read more. He wanted to know why. He wanted to know how deep the rabbit hole went. But the new illuminated square on the door was getting very bright. The freed test subjects were at the door, bracing themselves for the impending breach. Randy reached into his backpack and threw several more squares onto the ground. They each sprouted legs. The final stretch of light connected the last top segment to its corners, completing the square. In a blur of light and smoke, the hole the guards had cut for themselves fell to the floor with a thunderous boom. For a moment, all Randy and Reggie could see was smoke. Then they saw the green glow of the guards' energy rifles powering up. The guards opened fire through the smoke, and their blasts tinged off Randy's exosuits. All of the test subjects they had freed began shooting into the cloud of dissipating smoke. 2 four-legged, dog-sized robots leapt through the haze. Randy rolled his eyes. He'd kind of been joking before when he suggested the presence of robotic guard dogs at the Institute. The fact that they actually had them annoyed him. Reggie pulled his phaser out, set it to kill, then opened fire on the dogs. He hit one, and it froze. Several orange arcs of electricity shot from it, and it fell to the ground. The other dog ran toward Randy. He pulled his phaser, but before he could fire, the dog shot an energy blast at his hand, hitting his phaser and causing it to malfunction. Reggie aimed to shoot the dog, but he was too close and wasn't sure what would happen if he accidentally hit Randy. As the dog barreled down on Randy, Hope, still on her mother's back, screamed. Her mother turned and ran to Randy as the robot jumped into the air. It landed on him and began firing a barrage of energy blasts at his face, which was now covered with the white liquid metal. It was designed to take a pummeling, but if the rapid energy blasts from the dog kept up like they were, they would quickly burn a hole in the suit, just like the guards had burned a hole through the door. Hope's mother got to Randy and grabbed the robotic dog by one of its sleek metal back legs. With her augmented arm, she pulled it into the air. Then she began slamming it on the ground, over and over, like an angry child with a rag doll. The impact of the slams made the dog malfunction. Sparks flew from it, and it started to buzz and twitch. Hope's mom threw it across the room and beat her chest a few times with her non-bionic arm in triumph. The test subjects were busy laying down cover fire with their eyes as the mob of guards entered the room. Randy could now see that a good number of the guards were in armor of their own, and the shots from the subjects' eyes were only doing minimal damage to them. One of the freed subjects was hit with a shot that penetrated through the liquid metal and was kneeling, wounded, on the floor. The shooting stopped, and the guard who had shot him yelled out, "Sending effective energy frequency range. Set weapons to incoming thresholds." Reggie looked at Randy. The guard's words might as well have been gibberish to him. Randy yelled, "They figured out how to fire through our suits. Find cover." The test subjects kept firing into the mob as Randy, Reggie, Hope, and her mother ducked behind one of the desks. "I can recalibrate our suit's liquid frequency and reconfigure our damage thresholds," Randy yelled. Reggie looked at him with wide eyes and shook his head. His expression asked, "What the hell did you just say?" An energy blast pinged off the top of the metal desk they were huddled under. "I can fix our suits," Randy clarified. A holographic display shot from his wrist, and he quickly cycled through a series of floating settings. He adjusted several, and all of their exosuits changed from white to black. Randy yelled, "There, that'll keep them off us for a little while." Reggie pulled himself over the top of the desk and began firing the rifle he had taken from the first guard at the mob of new guards. The freed subjects were moving around the mob very quickly. Their movements were precise and agile. One of them got close to a guard and did a low, sweeping kick, knocking his legs out from under him. Randy pressed his fingers to his forehead and swirled them around a few times, trying to think. Another test subject rushed one of the guards and elbowed him in the face, sending him screaming and flailing to the ground. One subject, who had an extra arm on each side of her body, ran toward a firing guard. She grabbed his arms, each with 2 robotic hands. Then she ran up his body and kicked off of him, doing a backflip. As she did, she pulled his arms from his body. He screamed as blood poured from the holes where his arms used to be. Reggie, still firing at the guards, yelled down at Randy, "There's too many of them. The people we freed are making short work of some of them, and I'm trying to hit as many as I can, but..." There are just too many. I wish we could call for some goddamn backup like they did. Randy pulled his hand from his forehead. That's it, Reggie. You're a genius. You're the genius. I'm just along for the ride. What's the plan? Keep firing, Randy replied. Reggie yelled, That's not a great plan, kid. Randy rolled across the floor to another desk. The terminal where he was downloading the hard drives wasn't connected to any external networks, but that wasn't true for all of the terminals in the room. He opened the terminal at the desk he'd rolled to and accessed the security database for the level of the institute they were on. Then he accessed the security terminal in the room where they had freed the test subjects and opened more of the glass tubes and square containers containing the uncontrollable subjects. Randy yelled to Reggie, I let some of the ferals out. Reggie stopped firing and looked at him. You did what? An energy blast ricocheted off the desk next to him, and he ducked. I thought you were supposed to be a genius. Some of the guards that were at the door stopped shooting at them and turned to look down the hallway. A loud series of shrieks and howls echoed off the walls. The escaped, uncontrollable test subjects were coming at them like a stampede. Randy didn't like the idea of using the test subjects as cannon fodder. They might get killed, but if he hadn't done something, they'd all be killed and no one would be saved. An alarm was blaring now, and the lights that lined the room they were in the hallway were flashing red. Randy thought of the contrast above them. Someone was probably answering a professor's question in a calm evening class, while they were fighting for their lives just below. The test subjects on their side started firing even more shots at the distracted guards now. Randy ran back to Reggie's desk and threw a few more squares from his backpack. You probably don't have many more of those left, huh? Reggie asked. I'm saving one, just in case, Randy replied. Then he handed it to Reggie and said, You should hold on to it. Once the guards are pushed back enough out of the room and down the hallway, we've got to make a run for it, back to the other room. The newly freed subjects, although feral, seemed to have little interest in the coherent, in-control subjects. At least for that moment, they were on the same team, fighting their captors, pushing them back down the hallway. What Randy and Reggie could see from the room were hundreds of energy blasts coming from both the subjects and the guards. The guards focused entirely on their new threat, and were retreating back down the hallway from where they came. Randy, Reggie, Hope, and her mother moved closer to the entrance of the room. They watched as one of the feral subjects wrapped a slithering appendage that shot from their chest around one of the guards' heads. He squeezed it, and it popped like a cherry. Another feral subject, a chimp, jumped onto another guard and began slamming his head into the concrete floor of the hallway. It burst into a crimson flood. Brain matter and bone fragments scattered around him and onto the face of the chimp. Randy grabbed the disks from the desk that had downloaded all of Archtech's secret information, and they ran for the door. The chimp that had just smashed the guard's head looked at them, and its eyes began to glow green. Then an energy blast hit its shoulder. It turned and jumped toward the mob of retreating guards, the last subject in the stampede of biological horrors. Let's go, Randy shouted. They ran down the hall toward the room. A few shots bounced off their exosuits. The non-feral test subjects stayed behind, following the guards. They reached the doors of the first room. They had closed after the ferals left as part of the security protocol. Randy used the terminal and overrode the protocol, opening the door. As it slid open, Randy was kicked in the face. He flew backward and slid across the floor of the hall. Hope and her mother let out a scream, and Reggie pulled out his rifle. There was a figure in a mech suit, similar to the ones some of the guards had been wearing. The helmet of the suit retracted, and Reggie recognized the man beneath from the video he'd seen earlier. It was the general. He yelled, "Randall!" Randy was dazed on the floor. Everything was wavy, and he felt like a ton of bricks had just smacked him in the face. Hope's mother screamed again. The general turned to her. "Oh, shut up, you stupid fucking animal!" Reggie fired at the general, but his shot only bounced off his chest. The general fired a shot at Reggie. He screamed as it sizzled through the liquid armor on his arm. "That's right," the general yelled. "The other guards have adjusted the energy threshold. You're vulnerable again." Reggie threw his weapon to the ground. The sound of the chaos down the hall reverberated all around them, along with the ringing alarms. Hope and her mother ran to Randy and looked over him frantically. Reggie, still hungry for answers, yelled at the general, Why are you doing all this? Why did you take my son? Or why did you take any of these people? The general lowered his rifle a little and looked away from its sights. Why? The general asked. Because the world is out of control, and Archtech plans to become the control they need. Your son was an important piece to all of this. He was one of the first tests. Without him, we wouldn't have come this far. You should be proud of him. Reggie started to laugh. The general raised his rifle to his eye again. Reggie stopped laughing and said, You are just like the goddamn Bond villains. Everything falls to pieces around you, and you're still so far up your own ass that you can't see the reality of the situation. I am proud of Jake. What the general didn't see, while giving his generic, arrogant villain speech, was that Reggie had pulled out the final robotic square from a compartment on the back of his suit. He hurled it at the general. It landed on his rifle and coated it, and his hands, in liquid metal. The general screamed and shook his arms, trying to fling the metal away. It spread and encapsulated his arms. They were bound and useless. In a last-ditch effort, he opened the back of his mech armor and stepped out of it, reaching for the pistol that hung from its side. Hope's mother saw this and jumped toward him. The general turned and fired at her just before she landed on him. She flew backward, but Hope, who had been on her back, jumped and continued to fly at him. She landed on his chest and wrapped her legs around him. Then she began tearing at his face. He dropped the pistol and tried to pull her off in a panic, but with the power of her suit, she was too strong. Over and over, she clawed at him, scraping her metal claws against his face, scratching away layers of flesh and gashing his eyes and nose. He fell backwards, past the open doors and into the containment lab. Hope jumped off of him as he fell, and she ran back into the hallway. He got to his feet and ran deeper into the room, clutching his blood-soaked face. Flesh and blood were covering his general disguise, soaking his green uniform. Randy, realizing what had happened, snapped out of his daze and got to his feet. He ran to the door's terminal and accessed the security functions. Then, he opened all of the remaining black tubes and glass cubes inside the room. They watched as a room of feral test subjects ascended upon the general, tearing his limbs from his body and disemboweling him as he screamed. The screams became guttural and drowned out with blood. One of the subjects turned and looked at the open door. His eyes began to glow green just as the door slammed closed. Hope's mother had been shot, so had Reggie, but luckily neither of the wounds were fatal. Although their suits had been compromised, they still had enough defense integrity to keep them somewhat shielded from the blasts. The four of them ran down the hallway to the elevator they'd come in on. Randy bypassed the security lock, and they got on. They shot up, away from the chaos. Reggie let out a celebratory yell and then looked at Randy. Reggie's smile faded, and then he said, There's so many of them down there. No way we can get them all out on our own. Randy pulled the discs with the downloaded information out of his backpack and said, I'm sure they have more than just this one facility, but this information will be a start to ending all of this. They didn't know what awaited them once the elevator doors opened. The elevator dinged, and to their surprise, they were greeted with the warm, calm night air. No SWAT teams, no mechanized test subjects, just a few college students walking past after an evening class. Their van was right where they'd left it, and they quickly got in before anyone noticed them. Why aren't they up here? Reggie asked, closing his door. Randy was thankful they weren't, and he explained that it probably meant a few things. One, Archtech's corruption hadn't spread to the police or the actual U.S. government, and two, this particular lab's guards were outnumbered by the unleashed test subjects below. They sped away from the Institute before the luck of their situation changed. They reached the outskirts of Boston and pulled into a small 24-hour diner on the edge of the road. Stay in the car, Randy said. I ain't going nowhere, Reggie replied, puffing a cigarette. Randy ran in and looked around frantically. There were two men at the far end of the diner that had stopped talking and turned to stare at him. Randy realized his liquid metal suit was still covering his body, and disengaged it. The men kept staring. A waitress came out of the kitchen behind the counter. Randy ran up and put his hands on the counter. I need a phone, please. The waitress pulled a toothpick out of her mouth and said, Phone's for paying customers, sweetie. Randy looked around and saw a pie counter to the left of him. Fine, pie. Give me some pie. What kind? The waitress asked, flatly. Any kind, Randy shouted. Then, lowering his voice, he said, Please, it's an emergency. The waitress looked at his bruised face and wide eyes. She pulled a phone with a long cord from behind the counter and sat it in front of Randy. Thank you, he said, then began dialing his parents' number. His dad answered, and for a moment, Randy didn't know what to say. Hello? Hello? Dad. Randy's voice didn't feel like it was his own. Randy? Oh my God! We were told you were... Randy finished his sentence. Dead? Yeah, his dad continued. Where are you? Look, Dad, I don't have a lot of time. I'm safe, and everything's going to be okay. Listen to me. You and Mom have got to leave right now. Drive as far as you can and don't tell anyone where you're going. You'll know when it's safe to come home. He heard his mom in the room. Oh my God, Randy? Baby, where are you? Randy continued. You're not safe. Leave now. We'll see each other again, but you've got to go. Trust me. His father was silent, and then said, Okay, we'll go. Now. Be safe, son. We love you. I love you too, Randy said, then hung up the phone. The waitress and the two men were still staring at him. Then he heard a small explosion outside in the parking lot. Everyone turned to look, and Randy ran to the door. There was a ball of smoke in the air by the road, and Reggie was holding his phaser in front of him. He noticed Randy and yelled, A goddamn drone, looking for us. We better go. Randy ran to the van and they left. Randy and Reggie took the information they'd gathered about Archtech to the press and to the authorities. It spread like wildfire. The other scientists who were organizing escapes for other subjects stepped forward. Every headline across America and the world blew up with the information Randy had downloaded. Archtech was exposed. Their hands were full trying to cover up the truth. Hundreds of test subjects were rescued from several exposed labs across America. Randy was tired of running, and he was tired of letting Archtech control his life and the lives of others. He fortified Reggie's home and his parents with sophisticated security, just in case Archtech wanted to come to their doorsteps. Randy reunited with his family and gave them the full story, the true one that wasn't exaggerated by the news. Even that was pretty unbelievable. After some weeks, Randy returned to Reggie's scrapyard in Rutherford. He unlocked the side gate, and it swung open. He was greeted by Hope, jumping into his arms. Hope's mother wasn't far, swinging from the new play equipment Reggie had installed for them. Reggie lifted his head from a truck he was working on and wiped his hands on his overalls as Randy walked over. The phone calls won't stop. I had to unplug the damn thing. I don't know how they got my number, but I'm glad they haven't found out where I live. Thanks for that. Randy nodded as he stroked the hair on top of Hope's head. Then he said, I got a lead from a college in Kansas City. The cops say they didn't find anything, but I think they're wrong. Reggie reached out and scratched Hope's chin. Then he looked back up at Randy. I haven't had a chance to really thank you, Randy. I'd probably be here drinking myself into an early grave if you hadn't shown up. We got answers, and I can sleep again, even with the phone ringing off the hook. Hope's mother walked up beside Reggie, and he tousled her hair. You don't have to thank me, Randy said. Without you, we couldn't have done any of this. Without Jake, it would have been impossible. Hope pawed at Randy's chin. Oh, and how could I forget? You too. Kansas City's pretty far. Probably take us a couple days to get there, Reggie said. Randy waved his hand across the skyline and replied, To boldly go where no man has gone before. To Randy's surprise, Reggie got the Star Trek reference, and they both started to laugh. Thank you so much for being here and listening to this story. I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I loved writing it. It was a bit longer than any of my other stories, my first two-parter on this podcast. And it also dove into the realm of science fiction a little more than the rest of my stories. So if this is the first story you've listened to on this podcast, it's a little different than the others. I usually so far, I've been sticking to the realms of, I've gotten a little science fiction-y here and there. The first one and maybe the fourth one, I think. Dreambox and Uma both lean into the science fiction realms, but this one really took a deeper dive into that genre. And I don't know exactly why that is. I feel like I was brainstorming story ideas for a little while, and I kept coming back to this premise over and over, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do it. I'm going to write it, and I'm going to get it out. So, like I said, I really hope you enjoyed it. The next story swerves back a bit to the realm of sort of paranormal and suspense. If you'd like to support the podcast, there are a few ways you can do it. The first of which being leaving a review or a rating on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. The second is just letting your friends and family know about the podcast. Word of mouth goes a super long way. So if you enjoy these stories, let some people that you love know. The last way is by checking out my Patreon over at patreon.com/strangewhispers, where I have some exclusive stories. You get early access to episodes, and I also share other things in there like inspirations and kind of where my ideas come from and how they manifest. However you support, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'll see y'all for the next story, and until then, keep creating.